And I think we've heard the term quite a bit already, cost of inaction. And I think in particular, the NGFS has published a lot of interesting papers and research articles around this. So I would love to hand the word to Sabine Mauderer.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you. And I think what you heard from Johan and also from Frank was, I think, quite, telling that cost of inaction are pretty high. But maybe since Moritz, you mentioned the NGFS, for most of you, most probably have not heard what is this animal about. So as Frank, I'm also in the central bank community. And besides being the first deputy governor of the German central bank, I'm also the chair of this so-called Network for Greening the Financial System. And this is an organization of more than, about 150 central banks and banking supervisory agencies that have come together to better understand the financial risks that climate and also nature bear. So and I just want to pick up what Johan said. Well, it's sometimes surprising, or more said that, it seems that we all know the figures and what is going to happen. And still, this room is not packed. And I mean, climate is not so prominent on the agenda than it was a couple of years before. So the question is, why is this, right? And maybe I start with the good news. So I think we have a diverse world. So in the beginning of January, one of our, a very important member of this network I just mentioned, it was the Federal Reserve Bank of the US, gave me a call and say, well, unfortunately, they want or they will exit our organization. And we don't have to discuss why. I think you all know this. And of course, as you can imagine, my concern was at that time, or maybe this is the end of our organization, or many will exit it as well. But this was definitely not the case. And I can tell you, this is the good news, is it was rather the opposite. So we even this year got new central banks who said, oh, hello, this is a great organization, and I need to do or understand much more about the climate risk and climate finance. So can I also become a member? So over the last month, we had I think 5 to 6 new members. So, and this tells you, and global. So the interest is still very high. But so why, as I said, it's a diverse world. So on the one hand, we see scientists, technocrats like central banks with an increasing interest and much more work. And on the other hand, we see, a decreasing interest from the population and also from the corporate world. And I think what we, and also in this bubble here today, is really have to understand is we are in our own bubble. For us, figures, numbers, curves we'd like to discuss is pretty clear and it's obvious. But we are just a bubble and we are a really small community. So I think our task is to translate our knowledge we do have, which will develop over the next years, as to translate it to everyone who needs to know. And I think this is something what we try to do also in our international organization with the so-called scenarios. So what we do a lot of things, but one of our flagship products are the so-called climate scenarios. So we have long-term scenarios, basically having a look at, okay, what could be the world by 2050 in political terms? Would we see no climate in action at all? So we end up in a hot world, a hot house world scenario? Or would we just see, okay, we are now experiencing fatigue, but maybe in 5 years' time, there's a new generation, and all of a sudden, suddenly the politicians awake, and then we would have a significant delay on transition, but we still would have a transition. So as you can imagine, there are different scenarios you can think of, and each scenario has an assumptions do have a different impact on the economic outcome. So what does that mean in terms of economic growth for regions, for the globe. What does that mean in terms of inflation, of productivity, of employment rates, and so on? So these scenarios we do. What we, and this is what Johan said, is why then, central bank were interested, maybe also banking supervision agencies, but why doesn't it raise more interest from, the general or corporate side? And the reason is because 2050 is too far away. What we need to do is to give a little bit more on a short-term and medium-sized perspective. So that was the reason why we just in May this year published a rather short to medium-term scenarios that have a time horizon to 2030. And this is a time horizon where even CEOs and CFOs, but also politically elected parties or politicians really think, okay, this is within my term I'm responsible for. So I rather have a look at this. And I think this is the key point of, how can we mobilize more people also in finance or those who are responsible. So maybe one thing I want to highlight about the basic understanding of where does the money come from and why isn't there more money mobilized. I think the world is still thinking that it is about public money, and also the negotiations here by nature are basically about what can sovereigns, what do governments contribute to this. But to be honest, I think we all know this is just a fraction of the money we need. The vast majority needs to come from the private sector. And just to give you a little bit of some numbers to tell how little in the future also from the public side might come is we live in a time of a really high debt level of the sovereigns, of the government. We have the IMF just published new figures, and it tells you that the global average debt to GDP, so growth to debt ratio, is now on average 100%. And just, 15 years ago, it was 70%, which historically is already pretty high. So if you see that not just emerging markets or developing countries are suffering from high debt levels, now also the advanced economies where usually the money transfer comes from are really suffering from extremely high debt levels. So what does that tell you? That, mobilizing climate finance is becoming more and more challenging in a time where we definitely, as Johan and Frank also pointed out, need even more. And if we continue to talk about that, I could, as you imagine, I'm very passionate about this topic, but I stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you so much, Sabine. And I'm sure we will have some time at the end for an open Q&A. But just one follow-up question. So you talked about the short-term scenarios and obviously the NGFS role in the central banking community. For actors outside of the central banking world, do you see value in the toolkits and extensive knowledge that you have acquired through the community? I'm thinking about actors in countries that are actively supporting transitions, multilateral development banks, but also finance ministries that could really benefit from these scenarios and the technical capabilities?
Yeah, sure. So we know already that pension funds, that even big American indices are using our scenarios, right? And also some corporates have a look at it, some use that, or even part of it using that. When it comes to the short-term scenarios, this is something where, we started this in May, and we started with extreme weather events. So these are in comparison to the long-term scenarios, our short-term scenarios are rather extreme scenarios. This might happen, but not necessarily will happen. So in order to being used by a broader community out of the central bank work, what our next step would be is to have rather centered short-term or medium-term scenarios in order to allow also other stakeholders to use them. Thank you.
Thank you so much.